when 30-year-old homeless Marine Anthony Wells was handcuffed and charged with trespassing after heroically saving 8-year-old Billy Martinez from a savage bulldog attack in Clearwater County's Maple Ridge neighborhood, everyone assumed they were witnessing just another routine arrest of a troubled veteran. But when Judge Margaret Foster called his name in courtroom 3B and heard the details of his military service record, her face went white and her hands began to tremble, because the homeless man standing before her in shackles was the same Marine who had carried her wounded son to safety under enemy fire in Afghanistan, saving his life and earning the Medal of Honor in the process. What happened next had never occurred in any courtroom before. The judge stood up, removed her robes, and did something that left every person in that room speechless and brought hardened court officers to tears. This is the story of how a simple trespassing case became the most extraordinary moment of justice ever witnessed. Quick pause before we continue. Tell us, where in the world are you watching from? If you're enjoying these stories, make sure to hit subscribe, because tomorrow's episode is absolutely mind-blowing. The morning sun cast long shadows across Maple Ridge, one of Clearwater County's most affluent neighborhoods, where manicured lawns stretched between million-dollar homes. Anthony Wells moved quietly along the sidewalk, his weathered marine-issue backpack slung over one shoulder, the faded olive-green canvas showing years of hard living on Nevada's unforgiving streets. His beard, once regulation-trimmed, now hung scraggly past his collar, streaked with premature gray that spoke of nights spent sleeping rough and days scrounging for survival. At 30 years old, Tony carried himself with the distinctive posture of a Marine, shoulders back, eyes scanning, alert despite the exhaustion that seemed to weigh down his every step. His clothes, donated from various shelters, hung loose on his diminished frame. A careful observer might notice the way he automatically checked corners and doorways, the ingrained habits of someone trained for combat now applied to the different battlefield of civilian homelessness. The neighborhood around him buzzed with the comfortable routine of suburban prosperity. Sprinkler systems hissed across perfect grass, expensive cars backed out of 3-car garages, and children's bicycles lay carelessly abandoned on driveways, symbols of a security Tony hadn't known for years. He kept his head down, moving with purpose toward the small park at the neighborhood's heart, where he sometimes found discarded bottles worth a few cents at the recycling center. "Mommy, I want to pet the doggy." The excited voice of 8-year-old Billy Martinez echoed across the quiet street as he broke away from his mother, Carmen, who was juggling grocery bags while trying to unlock their modest apartment door. Billy, small for his age with dark hair and an infectious smile, spotted the massive bulldog that had somehow escaped from the backyard of a nearby house. The dog, a muscular beast named Brutus, stood nearly 3 feet tall and weighed close to 80 pounds of solid muscle and territorial aggression. Carmen Martinez, a single mother working 2 jobs to afford even their small rental in this expensive neighborhood, didn't immediately notice her son's dash toward the animal. She was exhausted from her early morning shift at the hospital cafeteria, her mind already focused on getting Billy ready for school and herself prepared for her afternoon shift at the grocery store. "Billy, honey, stay close to Mommy," she called, distractedly, still wrestling with her keys while balancing the bags. But Billy was already approaching the bulldog, his 8-year-old mind seeing only a big, friendly pet that might want to play. Brutus, however, was known throughout the neighborhood as aggressive and territorial. His owner, Mrs. Dorothy Whitman, had received multiple complaints about the dog's behavior, but the 75-year-old woman insisted her pet was simply protective. Tony noticed the situation developing from 50 yards away. His Marine training kicked in automatically, assessing the threat level and calculating response options. The child was moving directly toward an agitated animal that outweighed him by 60 pounds. The mother was distracted. The dog's body language, Low head, raised hackles, tense stance. Screamed danger to anyone trained to read such signs. "Hey kid, stop!" Tony called out, but Billy either didn't hear him or didn't understand the urgency in his voice. Brutus saw the approaching child as an invasion of his territory. The dog's lips pulled back in a snarl, revealing teeth designed for one purpose. Without warning, the animal lunged forward with the speed and power that had made bulldogs legendary for their fighting ability. Billy froze in terror as 90 pounds of snarling muscle hurtled toward him. In that split second, Tony made the decision that would change everything. Dropping his backpack, he sprinted across the manicured lawn of Mrs. Whitman's property, his worn boots digging into the expensive sod as he launched himself between the charging dog and the child. The impact knocked Billy backward onto the soft grass as Tony absorbed the full force of Brutus's attack. The dog's jaws clamped down on Tony's forearm, the same arm that had carried wounded Marines to safety in Afghanistan, now serving as a shield for a child he'd never met. Tony rolled with the animal's momentum, using his body weight and training to control the situation without harming the dog. "It's okay, boy, it's okay," Tony spoke calmly, even as the dog's teeth found purchase through his worn jacket. He'd learned in the Marines that panic was contagious, but so was calm confidence. The dog, sensing no aggression from this new target, gradually relaxed its grip, confusion replacing the territorial fury. Carmen Martinez's grocery bags scattered across the pavement as she ran toward her son, her heart hammering with a mother's worst fear. "Billy! Oh God, Billy!" The boy sat up slowly, tears streaming down his face, but physically unharmed. "Mommy, the doggy was going to bite me, but the man saved me." Tony carefully disengaged from Brutus, who now seemed almost embarrassed by his aggressive display. Blood seeped through Tony's jacket sleeve, but he showed no sign of pain as he helped Billy to his feet and guided him toward his mother's waiting arms. "Is he hurt?" Tony asked Carmen, his voice carrying the kind of calm authority that had once commanded respect in military hospitals far from home. Carmen knelt beside her son, her hands trembling as she checked him for injuries. "I think he's okay." "Oh my God, thank you. Thank you so much. You saved my baby's life." Mrs. Dorothy Whitman had emerged from her house at the sound of the commotion, her elderly face creased with worry and confusion. She surveyed the scene, her escaped dog, the crying child, the homeless man with blood on his sleeve, and her previously pristine lawn now bearing the marks of the struggle. "What's going on here? Who are you and what are you doing on my property?" Her voice carried the sharp tone of someone accustomed to having her authority respected in this neighborhood. Tony looked down at his position, suddenly aware that he was standing on private property without permission. In the crisis of saving Billy, he hadn't considered the legal implications of his actions. "Mom, your dog got loose and was attacking the boy. You're trespassing," Mrs. Whitman interrupted, her fear and confusion manifesting as anger. "I'm calling the police. Brutus wouldn't hurt anyone unless he was provoked." Carmen stood up, still holding Billy protectively. "This man saved my son's life. Your dog would have seriously hurt him if—" "That's not true," Mrs. Whitman snapped, though her voice lacked conviction. "Brutus is a good dog. This vagrant probably provoked him somehow." The word vagrant hit Tony like a physical blow, but he didn't respond. He'd heard worse in his years on the streets, had learned that defending himself usually only made situations worse. Instead, he picked up his backpack and started to walk away, hoping to avoid further confrontation. But the sound of approaching sirens cut through the morning air. Someone else in the neighborhood had called 911, reporting what looked like an assault in progress. Within minutes, 2 Clearwater County patrol cars pulled up to the scene, their red and blue lights drawing curious neighbors from their homes. Officer Steve Thompson, a 10-year veteran of the force, approached the group with his hand resting casually on his duty belt. His partner, Officer Patricia Smith, began setting up a perimeter and taking initial statements from witnesses. "What's the situation here?" Thompson asked, his experienced eyes taking in the scene. The elderly homeowner, the Hispanic mother and child, and the homeless man with blood on his sleeve who was clearly trying to leave. Mrs. Whitman spoke first, her voice shaky but determined. "This man was trespassing on my property. I want him arrested." Carmen stepped forward immediately. "Officer, this man saved my son's life. Mrs. Whitman's dog attacked Billy, and this gentleman put himself in danger to protect my child." Thompson looked at Tony, noting the military bearing despite the worn clothes and homeless appearance. "Sir, what's your name?" "Anthony Wells," Tony replied quietly, meeting the officer's gaze directly. "I can explain what happened. He was trespassing," Mrs. Whitman insisted. "I don't care what he says happened. This is a private neighborhood, and people like him don't belong here." Officer Smith approached with Billy, who had been eager to tell his version of events. "The boy says the homeless man saved him from the dog attack. He's pretty clear about what happened." Thompson studied the situation more carefully. The physical evidence supported the story. Tony's torn sleeve and bite marks, the disturbed lawn showing signs of a struggle, and the child's consistent account. But Mrs. Whitman was a long-time resident with political connections, while Tony was clearly homeless and had no legal right to be on the property. "Ma'am, I understand this man may have helped your son," Thompson said to Carmen, "but the property owner is pressing trespassing charges. I have to follow the law." Tony had expected this outcome. In his experience, homeless veterans rarely received the benefit of the doubt in legal situations. "I understand, officer. I was on her property without permission." "You saved my son," Carmen protested. "This is ridiculous." But Thompson was already reaching for his handcuffs. "Sir, I'm placing you under arrest for trespassing. You have the right to remain silent." As the Miranda rights were read, Tony offered no resistance. He'd been arrested before for similar minor infractions: loitering, vagrancy, sleeping in unauthorized areas. The system had its procedures, and he'd learned that cooperation made everything easier. Carmen Martinez stood holding her son, tears of frustration streaming down her face as she watched the man who had saved Billy being led away in handcuffs. "This isn't right," she whispered to Officer Smith. "This isn't right at all." The patrol car doors slammed shut with Tony in the back seat, and Maple Ridge returned to its comfortable quiet, leaving only a few scattered grocery bags and some disturbed grass as evidence that anything extraordinary had happened at all. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The Clearwater County Detention Center processed Anthony Wells with the mechanical efficiency of a system that handled hundreds of minor offenders each week. The booking officer, a heavy-set man named Carl Martinez, who had worked the night shift for 15 years, barely looked up from his paperwork as Tony was led through the intake procedures. "Empty your pockets on the counter," Officer Martinez instructed, his voice carrying the bored tone of someone who had repeated these words thousands of times. Tony complied silently, placing his few possessions on the scarred metal surface. A worn wallet containing no credit cards or identification beyond an expired Nevada driver's license. $37 in crumpled bills and loose change. A small plastic bag containing his military dog tags, carefully wrapped to prevent the metal from scratching. A photograph of a woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile, the edges soft from years of handling. "Who's this?" Martinez asked, holding up the photograph with unexpected gentleness. "My wife," Tony replied quietly. "She passed away 5 years ago." The booking officer studied Tony's face for a moment, recognizing something in the man's eyes that spoke of loss deeper than homelessness. "Cancer?" Tony nodded, unable to trust his voice with more words. Martinez set the photograph down carefully with the other belongings. "My sister went the same way. I'm sorry for your loss." The brief moment of human connection passed as quickly as it had come. Tony was photographed, fingerprinted, and issued a standard orange jumpsuit that hung loose on his diminished frame. His clothes, including the blood-stained jacket that bore witness to his morning heroics, were sealed in a plastic bag and stored with his other possessions. The holding cell contained 6 other men in various stages of their own legal troubles. A drunk driver sobering up from the previous night's poor decisions, 2 teenagers caught shoplifting at the mall, an elderly man arrested for disturbing the peace after arguing too loudly with his landlord. The atmosphere was thick with the resigned quiet of people waiting for bail money or court appointments. Tony found an empty spot on the metal bench and settled in to wait. He'd been through this process before, a night or 2 in holding, a quick court appearance, maybe a fine or community service, then back to the streets. The routine had become as familiar as his old military drills, just with different uniforms and different rules. "What you in for?" asked Jake Williams, a man in his 40s whose multiple tattoos suggested extensive experience with the criminal justice system. "Trespassing," Tony answered simply. Williams snorted with amusement. "Trespassing? What did you do? Sleep in someone's fancy garden?" Something like that. The conversation died there. Tony had learned that in jail, just like in the military, sometimes the best policy was to keep your mouth shut and your head down. But Williams wasn't finished with his curiosity. "You got that look, man." "Military?" Tony nodded reluctantly. "Army? Navy? Marines?" Williams' attitude shifted immediately, his voice taking on a note of respect. "No shit. My older brother was a Marine. Did 2 tours in Iraq before an IED took his leg. You serve overseas?" "Afghanistan." "Rough tour?" Tony's silence was answer. "Enough." Williams retreated to his own spot on the bench, understanding that some subjects weren't open for casual conversation. Hours passed with the numbing slowness that characterized all institutional waiting. Guards changed shifts, meals were delivered, lukewarm sandwiches and watery coffee that Tony consumed without complaint. He'd eaten far worse in far more dangerous places. As evening approached, a guard appeared at the cell door with a clipboard. "Wells, Anthony, you made bail." Tony looked up in confusion. He hadn't called anyone, had no money for bail, and knew no one in Clearwater County who would post bond for a homeless stranger. "There must be some mistake," he said to the guard. "A young woman whose nameplate read Officer Davis. No mistake. Someone posted your bail an hour ago. You're free to go pending your court date." Tony gathered his few belongings and followed Officer Davis through the detention center's labyrinthine corridors. At the release desk, he was handed his civilian, clothes and possessions, plus a manila envelope containing his bail paperwork. "Your benefactor is waiting in the lobby," Officer Davis informed him as he changed back into his street clothes. The lobby of the Clearwater County Detention Center was a sterile space with fluorescent lighting and uncomfortable plastic chairs. Carmen Martinez sat near the window, still wearing her grocery store uniform from her afternoon shift. Billy sat beside her, quietly drawing on a piece of paper with a broken crayon. Tony stopped short, genuinely surprised to see them. "Ma'am, you didn't need to—" Carmen stood up quickly, her face showing the strain of a difficult day. "You saved my son's life. The least I could do was make sure you didn't spend the night in jail for being a hero." "I appreciate the gesture, but I can't accept—" "It's not charity," Carmen interrupted firmly. "It's justice. What happened today was wrong, and I'm going to make sure everyone knows it." Billy looked up from his drawing, his dark eyes serious beyond his 8 years. "Mr. Tony, I drew you a picture." The boy held up his artwork, a crude but recognizable scene showing a man protecting a child from a large dog. Stick figures, but the message was clear. At the bottom, in careful first-grade letters, Billy had written, "My hero." Tony accepted the drawing with hands that trembled slightly. "Thank you, Billy. This means more to me than you know." Carmen gathered her purse and took Billy's hand. "Your court date is tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. Courtroom 3B. I'll be there to testify about what really happened." "Mrs. Martinez, you don't understand. The legal system doesn't usually work in favor of people like me. Mrs. Whitman has money and connections. I'm just a homeless veteran with a record of minor infractions." "Then it's time the system heard a different perspective," Carmen replied with determination. "Billy and I will be there to tell the truth." Outside the detention center, the Nevada evening air carried the desert's characteristic coolness after a warm day. Carmen offered Tony a ride, but he declined, preferring to walk the 3 miles back toward the area where he usually spent his nights. "Where will you sleep tonight?" she asked with genuine concern. "I'll find somewhere safe." "I always do." Carmen hesitated, clearly wanting to offer more help, but understanding that Tony's pride wouldn't accept charity beyond what she'd already provided. "Will you at least take this?" She handed him a $20 bill. "For food." Tony wanted to refuse, but the practical part of his mind recognized that he hadn't eaten a real meal in 2 days. "I'll pay you back." "No, you won't," Carmen smiled. "You'll just help the next person who needs it. That's how it works." As the Martinez family drove away, Tony began his long walk through Clearwater County's sprawling suburban landscape. The neighborhoods gradually shifted from upper-middle-class comfort to working-class functionality, to the more marginal areas where someone like him could find shelter without attracting unwanted attention. His destination was a small park near the industrial district where a cluster of homeless individuals had established an informal community. Nothing permanent, nothing that would attract police attention, but a place where people looked out for each other and shared information about food sources, safe sleeping spots, and which areas to avoid. The park's official name was Desert Springs Recreation Area, though the locals just called it the camp. A dozen or so people had gathered around a small fire built in a metal trash can, sharing whatever food they'd managed to acquire during the day. "Tony, where the hell have you been?" called out Pete Williams, a Vietnam veteran whose battles with alcohol and untreated PTSD had landed him on the streets 20 years earlier. Despite his own struggles, Pete served as the informal leader of their small community, settling disputes and making sure the more vulnerable members were protected. "Had some legal trouble in Maple Ridge," Tony replied, settling onto a piece of cardboard near the fire. "Those rich folks give you a hard time again?" Tony explained the day's events while the group listened with the attention that came from understanding how quickly circumstances could change for any of them. When he finished, an older woman named Sarah Martinez shook her head in disgust. "Sounds about right. Do something heroic. Get arrested for it. That's America for you." "The mother posted my bail," Tony added. "Court's tomorrow morning," Pete studied, his friend's face in the firelight. "You worried?" "Should I be?" "Depends on the judge. Some of them understand what we've been through. Others just see homeless troublemakers who need to be shuffled through the system." A younger man named Marcus Jones, recently discharged from the army after serving in Syria, leaned forward with interest. "What's the judge's name?" Tony pulled out his court paperwork and read by the fire's light. "Judge Margaret Foster." Pete and Sarah exchanged a look. "Foster's okay," Pete said after a moment. "Fair anyway, better than some we've dealt with." "Still," Sarah added, "wouldn't hurt to clean up tomorrow. First impressions matter in court." The group spent the next hour helping Tony prepare for his court appearance. Someone donated a clean shirt that almost fit. Another person shared a disposable razor and a small mirror. A third offered advice about courtroom etiquette and how to address the judge respectfully. As the fire died down and people began settling in for the night, Tony found himself thinking about Billy's drawing and Carmen's unexpected kindness. For the first time in years, someone had seen him as more than just a homeless nuisance. Someone had recognized that his actions, not his circumstances, defined who he was. But experience had taught him not to hope too much. Tomorrow's court appearance would likely result in a fine he couldn't pay, community service he'd complete without complaint, and then a return to the invisible existence he'd grown accustomed to. The system had its procedures, and those procedures rarely accommodated inconvenient truths about heroism or justice. He wrapped himself in his military-issue sleeping bag, the same one he'd carried through 3 deployments, and tried to sleep, despite the hard ground and the uncertainty of what morning would bring. Above him, the Nevada stars shone with the same indifferent brightness they'd shone over his military camps in Afghanistan, where he'd once been somebody important, somebody whose actions mattered. Tomorrow, he would discover whether any of that still counted for anything in Judge Margaret Foster's courtroom. The Clearwater County Municipal Courthouse stood like a monument to bureaucratic authority in the heart of downtown, its limestone facade weathered by decades of Nevada desert winds. Built in the 1980s, during a period of municipal optimism, the building had aged into institutional gray, its windows tinted dark against the morning sun that painted the surrounding city in harsh shadows. Tony Wells arrived 45 minutes early, a habit ingrained by military discipline and reinforced by years of learning that being late to court appearances only made bad situations worse. He wore the clean shirt donated by his homeless community, paired with his least-worn jeans and boots that had been scrubbed as clean as desert living allowed. His hair, still damp from washing at a public restroom sink, was combed back with the precision that marked him as former military, despite his current circumstances. The courthouse lobby buzzed with the morning rush of legal proceedings. Lawyers in expensive suits wheeled briefcases across polished floors, their conversations a mixture of Latin legal terms and casual discussion of golf handicaps. Families clustered nervously on benches, whispering among themselves while children fidgeted with barely contained energy. Court employees moved through the crowd with the purposeful efficiency of people who navigated this system daily. Tony found an empty bench near the metal detectors and settled in to wait, observing the controlled chaos around him. He noticed how different groups occupied different spaces. The lawyers claiming the central areas near the information desk, the families gathering near the windows where children could look outside, and people like himself gravitating toward the edges where they were less likely to draw attention. "Excuse me, are you Anthony Wells?" The voice belonged to a young man in his early 30s, wearing a rumpled suit that suggested either a very busy schedule or a very limited budget. His briefcase showed the worn corners of heavy use, and his tie was slightly askew in a way that spoke of hurried preparation. "Yes, sir. I'm Robert Taylor from the Public Defender's Office. I've been assigned to represent you in today's hearing." Tony stood respectfully, extending his hand for a brief shake. "I appreciate that, Mr. Taylor, but I was planning to represent myself." Robert Taylor's expression shifted to one of professional concern. "Mr. Wells, I understand the desire for independence, but trespassing charges can carry more consequences than you might realize. Even a misdemeanor conviction can affect your ability to access certain services, housing programs, employment opportunities. With respect, sir, those opportunities aren't exactly abundant for someone in my situation. Anyway," Taylor consulted his file, scanning the police report and witness statements that had been compiled overnight. "Actually, Mr. Wells, your case is somewhat unusual. The arresting officer noted that you were protecting a child from a dog attack. The mother has requested to testify on your behalf. There may be grounds for a necessity defense." Tony raised an eyebrow. "Necessity defense? The legal principle that sometimes breaking a minor law is justified to prevent a greater harm." Technically you were trespassing, but you were doing so to protect a child from serious injury. A sympathetic judge might consider that relevant. Before Tony could respond, the courthouse doors opened to admit Carmen Martinez and Billy, both dressed in their best clothes. Carmen wore a navy blue dress that Tony suspected she reserved for church and special occasions, while Billy sported a clip-on tie and shoes so polished they reflected the lobby's fluorescent lights. Carmen approached Tony and his lawyer with the determined stride of someone who had made important decisions and intended to follow through on them. "Mr. Wells, how are you feeling about today?" "Cautiously optimistic, thanks to you and Billy being here." Billy stepped forward, still clutching the drawing he'd made the previous evening. "I brought this to show the judge, so she knows you're a good person." Robert Taylor knelt down to Billy's eye level, his professional demeanor softening. "That's very thoughtful, Billy. The judge will definitely want to hear what you have to say about what happened yesterday." "Will the bad dog be there too?" Billy asked with the practical concern of an 8-year-old. "No, buddy," Taylor smiled. "Just people in the courtroom today." As they spoke, Mrs. Dorothy Whitman entered the courthouse, accompanied by a well-dressed man in his 50s, whose confident bearing and expensive briefcase marked him as private counsel rather than a public defender. Mrs. Whitman had traded her previous day's gardening clothes for a conservative pantsuit and pearls that spoke of old money and social position. Her lawyer, a man Tony would later learn, was named Harrison Blake, from one of Clearwater County's most prestigious firms, surveyed the lobby with the calculating gaze of someone assessing opposition. His eyes lingered on Tony's group for a moment before he guided Mrs. Whitman toward a cluster of chairs on the opposite side of the lobby. "That's the property owner," Carmen observed, following Tony's gaze. "She brought a lawyer." "Of course she did," Robert Taylor muttered, recognizing both the lawyer and the implications of his presence. Harrison Blake didn't handle minor trespassing cases unless significant money or political connections were involved. At 8:30, a bailiff emerged from the elevator bank and called out in a voice trained to carry across crowded spaces. "All parties for courtroom 3B, please proceed to the 3rd floor. Court will convene in 30 minutes. The elevator ride was awkwardly silent, with Mrs. Whitman and her lawyer occupying one corner while Tony's group clustered in the opposite. "A corner." Billy pressed his face against the elevator's small window, watching the floors count upward with the fascination of a child for whom courthouse visits were still novel experiences. Courtroom 3B reflected the building's utilitarian aesthetic. Functional wooden benches, fluorescent lighting that cast everything in institutional pale, and an American flag that hung motionless in the climate-controlled air. The judge's bench loomed at the front of the room, elevated to emphasize the authority of whoever would soon occupy it. Tony took a seat at the defendant's table while Robert Taylor arranged his files and prepared his notes. Carmen and Billy settled into the gallery's front row, where Billy immediately began practicing his testimony in whispered tones that carried his earnest determination to help the man who had saved him. Mrs. Whitman and Harrison Blake claimed the opposite side of the courtroom, their presence creating an invisible line of division that reflected the broader social tensions underlying the case. Other observers began filtering in: court employees, a few reporters drawn by the unusual circumstances, and several people whose interest in the proceedings wasn't immediately apparent. At precisely 9 o'clock, Sergeant Lisa Parker, the court bailiff, called the room to order. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Margaret Foster." Judge Margaret Foster entered from her chambers with the measured pace of someone who had presided over thousands of hearings. At 58, she carried herself with the dignity that came from decades of legal experience and the confidence of someone who had earned her position through merit rather than connections. Her graying hair was pulled back in a practical style, and her black robes conveyed the weight of judicial authority. But as she settled behind the bench and opened the case file, something in her demeanor suggested that this particular morning would be different from the routine proceedings that usually filled her docket. "Please be seated," she instructed, her voice carrying the clear tone of someone accustomed to being heard and obeyed. "We're here today for the arraignment of Anthony Wells on charges of criminal trespassing. Mr. Taylor, how does your client plead?" Robert Taylor stood, his earlier nervousness replaced by professional focus. "Your Honor, before entering a plea, I'd like to request permission to present evidence regarding the circumstances of the alleged trespassing." Judge Foster consulted her file, her expression neutral but attentive. "The court will hear brief testimony regarding circumstances, but this is an arraignment, not a trial. Proceed, but keep it concise." "Thank you, Your Honor. I call Carmen Martinez to testify." Carmen approached the witness stand with steady steps, her hand trembling only slightly as she placed it on the Bible for swearing in. "Do you solemnly swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?" "I do." Robert Taylor positioned himself where both Carmen and the judge could see him clearly. "Mrs. Martinez, please tell the court what you witnessed yesterday morning in the Maple Ridge neighborhood." Carmen's voice grew stronger as she began her testimony. "I was coming home from my morning shift at the hospital when my son Billy ran toward a large dog that had gotten loose. The dog was aggressive and I could see it was going to attack my child. Mr. Wells was walking nearby, and when he saw what was happening, he immediately ran to protect Billy." "What did Mr. Wells do specifically?" "He threw himself between the dog and my son. The dog bit him instead of Billy. Mr. Wells saved my child's life without thinking about his own safety." Judge Foster leaned forward slightly, her attention focused intently on Carmen's testimony. "Mrs. Martinez, in your opinion, what would have happened if Mr. Wells had not intervened?" "Your Honor, that dog weighs almost as much as my son, Billy. Would have been seriously injured, possibly killed. Mr. Wells is a hero, and he's being punished for doing the right thing." Harrison Blake rose from the prosecution table. "Objection, Your Honor. The witness is offering opinion testimony about events that didn't occur." "Sustained," Judge Foster ruled, but her tone suggested the objection was more procedural than substantive. "Mrs. Martinez, please limit your testimony to what you actually observed." "Of course, Your Honor. What I observed was a man risking his own safety to protect a child he didn't even know, and now he's being treated like a criminal for being a hero." As Carmen continued her testimony, Judge Foster found herself studying Anthony Wells with growing interest. Something about the man's bearing, his respectful posture and attentive silence, struck her as familiar in a way she couldn't immediately place. When Carmen finished and returned to her seat, Robert Taylor called Billy to testify. The 8-year-old approached the witness stand with the solemnity of someone who understood the importance of truth-telling, even if he didn't fully grasp the legal complexities surrounding his experience. "Billy," Robert Taylor said gently, "can you tell the judge what happened when you saw the dog yesterday?" "The doggy was really big and scary," Billy began, his young voice carrying clearly through the courtroom's acoustics. "I thought he wanted to play, but then he got mad and tried to bite me. Mr. Tony jumped in front of me and let the doggy bite him instead. He saved me." Judge Foster addressed Billy directly, her judicial demeanor softening appropriately for a child witness. "Billy, were you afraid?" "Yes, ma'am, but Mr. Tony made it okay. He's very brave." As Billy returned to his mother's side, Judge Foster turned her attention to the defendant himself. "Mr. Wells, please approach the bench." Tony stood and walked forward, maintaining the respectful posture that had been ingrained by military training and reinforced by years of navigating various institutional authorities. "Mr. Wells, I'm looking at your identification here, and I notice you served in the United States Marine Corps. Is that correct?" "Yes, Your Honor. 3 tours in Afghanistan. Judge Foster paused, studying the file more carefully. Something about the name, the service record, and the man's bearing was triggering a memory that she couldn't quite access. "What was your unit, Mr. Wells?" "2nd Battalion, 8th Marines, Your Honor." The judge's hand froze over the paperwork, her professional composure flickering for just a moment as a connection began forming in her mind. In the gallery, Carmen Martinez leaned forward, sensing that something significant was happening, but not understanding what. "Mr. Wells," Judge Foster said slowly, "what years did you serve in Afghanistan?" 2018 to 2021, Your Honor." The courtroom fell silent as Judge Foster stared at Anthony Wells, her judicial mask slipping as recognition dawned. In her eyes, the name, the unit, the time frame, suddenly pieces of a puzzle she'd carried for years began falling into place. Judge Margaret Foster's hands trembled as she set down the case file, her mind racing back to a phone call that had changed her life 3 years earlier. The call had come at 2 in the morning, rousing her from sleep with news that every military parent dreads. Her son, Lieutenant Jake Foster, had been critically wounded in an explosion outside Kabul. "Mr. Wells," she said, her voice carefully controlled despite the emotional storm building within her, "I need to call a brief recess to review some additional documentation. Court will reconvene in 15 minutes. The abrupt announcement sent murmurs through the gallery as Judge Foster rose from the bench with unusual haste. Sergeant Parker called for all to rise, but the judge had already disappeared into her chambers, leaving behind a courtroom full of confused observers. Robert Taylor turned to Tony with concern etched across his features. That was unusual. Judges don't typically recess during arraignments unless something significant has come up. Tony remained calm, though internally he wondered if some aspect of his military record had triggered additional scrutiny. "Maybe she's checking my service history. For character reference purposes." In the gallery, Carmen leaned over to whisper to Billy, who was growing restless in the formal courtroom environment. "Just a few more minutes, sweetheart. Sometimes grown-ups need time to think about important decisions," Mrs. Whitman conferred, quietly with Harrison Blake, her voice carrying an edge of impatience. "What's she doing back there? This should be a simple trespassing case. I want this vagrant prosecuted to the full extent of the law." Blake's expression remained professionally neutral, but his experienced eye recognized signs that the proceedings were taking an unexpected turn. "Mrs. Whitman, sometimes judges need to research precedent or verify information. We should be patient and let the legal process unfold." Behind the heavy oak door of her chambers, Judge Foster sat at her desk with shaking hands, staring at a framed photograph that held a place of honor among her judicial awards and family pictures. The image showed her son Jake in his Marine dress, blues, taken during his commissioning ceremony at Quantico. Beside it sat a letter she had read countless times, written on official Marine Corps letterhead and signed by his commanding officer. The letter detailed the circumstances of Jake's rescue following the roadside bomb that had nearly killed him. Shrapnel had severed an artery in his leg, and he was bleeding out in hostile territory when a Marine sergeant had carried him nearly 2 miles to a medical evacuation point, despite taking enemy fire and suffering his own wounds in the process. That Marine's name was Anthony Wells. Judge Foster picked up her secure phone and dialed a number she had memorized but rarely used. The call connected on the second ring to Colonel David Mitchell at Camp Pendleton. "Colonel, this is Judge Margaret Foster in Clearwater County, Nevada. I need to verify some information about a Marine who served under your command." "Of course, Your Honor. How can I assist you?" "Anthony Wells, 2nd Battalion, 8th Marines. He's currently in my courtroom on a minor charge, but I believe he may be the same Marine who saved my son's life in Afghanistan." The pause on the other end of the line stretched for several seconds before Colonel Mitchell responded. Judge Foster, I remember your son's case very well. Sergeant Wells carried Lieutenant Foster through 2 miles of hostile territory after that IED explosion. He saved your boy's life, no question about it. The confirmation hit Judge Foster like a physical blow. Colonel, what can you tell me about Sergeant Wells's current circumstances? Ma'am, I hate to say this, but we lost track of Tony after his discharge. He'd been dealing with some personal issues. His wife died of cancer while he was deployed, and he struggled with survivor's guilt from several combat incidents. He declined veteran services and seemed to just disappear into civilian life. Judge Foster closed her eyes, the full magnitude of the situation washing over her. Colonel, the man who saved my son is homeless and standing in my courtroom charged with trespassing for saving another child from a dog attack. Jesus Christ, Colonel Mitchell breathed. Your Honor, Anthony Wells is one of the finest Marines I ever had the privilege to command. If he's in legal trouble for helping someone, then the system has failed a genuine American hero. After ending the call, Judge Foster sat in the silence of her chambers, wrestling with the ethical implications of what she now knew. Judicial protocols required her to recuse herself from cases where she had personal connections to the defendant. But she also knew that Tony Wells had no idea who she was or what he had done for her family. She thought about Jake, now recovered from his injuries, and serving as a captain at Camp Lejeune, married with a 2-year-old daughter who called her grandmother Nana Maggie. Jake's entire future, his career, his family, his life, existed because Anthony Wells had refused to leave a wounded Marine behind. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Your Honor? Sergeant Parker's voice came through the door. The attorneys are asking about the length of the recess. 2 more minutes, Sergeant, Judge Foster replied, her decision crystallizing with sudden clarity. She picked up her phone again and dialed her son's direct number. Jake answered on the first ring, his voice carrying the crisp professionalism of an active duty officer. Jake, it's Mom. I need to ask you something important about Afghanistan. Of course, Mom. What's going on? The Marine who carried you to safety after the bombing. Do you remember his name? Sergeant Anthony Wells. Mom, I think about that man every day. He saved my life when he could have taken cover and saved himself. Why are you asking? Judge Foster took a deep breath. Because he's standing in my courtroom right now. The silence that followed spoke volumes about the significance of this moment. When Jake finally responded, his voice was thick with emotion. Mom, you have to help him. I don't care about protocol or procedures. That man gave me everything I have now. Judge Foster returned to the courtroom with renewed purpose, her judicial bearing intact, but her perspective fundamentally altered. As she took her seat behind the bench, she noticed Anthony Wells sitting quietly at the defendant's table, showing no signs of agitation or concern, despite the unusual delay. Court will come to order, Sergeant Parker announced. Mr. Wells, Judge Foster began, her voice steady but carrying an undercurrent of emotion that the trained ear might detect. I've had an opportunity to review your military service record more thoroughly. Tony stood respectfully. Yes, Your Honor. According to the documentation, you received several commendations during your service, including a Bronze Star with Valor. Is that correct? Yes, ma'am. Robert Taylor glanced at his client with surprise. This information hadn't been included in Tony's case file, and it painted a very different picture of the man he was representing. Judge Foster continued carefully, walking the line between personal knowledge and judicial propriety. The Bronze Star citation mentions your actions in rescuing a wounded officer under enemy fire. Can you tell the court about that incident? Tony shifted uncomfortably, clearly reluctant to discuss his military service in detail. Your Honor, I was just doing my job. Any Marine would have done the same thing. Mr. Wells, the court would appreciate your cooperation in providing context for these proceedings. Tony took a measured breath before responding. There was an IED explosion during a patrol outside Kabul. One of our officers was critically wounded and bleeding out. I carried him to the evacuation point. How far did you carry this wounded officer? Approximately 2 miles, Your Honor. Under enemy fire? Yes, ma'am. Judge Foster paused, allowing the weight of this testimony to settle over the courtroom. In the gallery, Carmen Martinez gripped Billy's hand tighter, understanding that she was witnessing something extraordinary unfold. Mr. Wells, in your opinion, what would have happened to that wounded officer if you had not intervened? Harrison Blake started to rise with an objection, but Judge Foster's sharp glance stopped him. Before he could speak, he would have died, Your Honor, Tony answered simply. Judge Foster leaned forward slightly, her judicial mask slipping just enough to reveal the profound emotion underneath. Mr. Wells, the wounded officer you saved that day was my son, Lieutenant Jake Foster. The courtroom erupted in gasps and murmurs as the revelation hit like a thunderclap. Carmen Martinez brought her hand to her mouth in amazement, while Billy looked around in confusion at the adult's dramatic reactions. Tony stood, frozen, his face showing genuine shock as he processed this information. Your Honor, I had no idea. Of course you didn't, Judge Foster said, her voice now openly emotional. But I want you to know that my son is alive today because of your courage and sacrifice. He's married now with a beautiful daughter. His entire future exists because you refuse to leave him behind. Robert Taylor remained standing, clearly overwhelmed by this unprecedented turn of events. In his 5 years as a public defender, he had never witnessed anything remotely similar to this courtroom drama. Mrs. Whitman whispered urgently to Harrison Blake, "This doesn't change the fact that he was trespassing on my property. I want him prosecuted." Blake placed a cautioning hand on his client's arm. "Mrs. Whitman, I strongly advise you to reconsider your position given these new circumstances." Judge Foster composed herself, returning to her judicial role despite the personal nature of the revelations. "In light of this information, I must address the ethical implications of my presiding over this case. However, given that the defendant was unaware of our connection, and given the extraordinary circumstances of both the original incident and Mr. Wells's subsequent military heroism, I'm going to make an unusual ruling." The courtroom fell silent, everyone understanding that they were witnessing a moment that would be remembered long after the legal proceedings concluded. "Mr. Wells, your actions yesterday in protecting young Billy Martinez demonstrate the same selfless courage you showed in Afghanistan. You placed yourself in danger to protect someone who couldn't protect themselves, just as you did for my son. This court finds that your violation of trespassing laws was justified under the doctrine of necessity, and all charges against you are hereby dismissed." The courtroom exploded in applause as Carmen Martinez hugged Billy, tears streaming down her face. Robert Taylor shook Tony's hand vigorously, while Sergeant Parker struggled to maintain order in the face of the crowd's emotional reaction. But the most remarkable moment came when Judge Foster stepped down from the bench, removed her judicial robes, and approached Anthony Wells as a mother rather than a judge. "Mr. Wells," she said, extending her hand, "my family owes you a debt we can never repay." The handshake between Judge Margaret Foster and Anthony Wells lasted longer than protocol would normally allow, a moment that bridged the gap between judicial authority and profound personal gratitude. The courtroom remained suspended in emotional silence, witnesses to something that transcended the typical boundaries of legal proceedings. "Mr. Wells," Judge Foster said, her voice still carrying the weight of her revelation. "I hope you'll allow me to introduce you to my son properly. He's been searching for you for 3 years." Tony struggled to find words, his military composure finally cracking under the magnitude of this unexpected reunion. "Your Honor, I never expected. I just did what any Marine would do." "No," Judge Foster replied firmly. "You did what heroes do. There's a difference." Harrison Blake approached his client with urgent whispers, clearly recognizing that the entire dynamic of the case had shifted beyond his ability to control. Mrs. Whitman's face showed a mixture of confusion and stubborn determination. "Your Honor," Blake interrupted reluctantly, "my client wishes to address the court." Judge Foster returned to her position behind the bench, though she remained standing rather than resuming the formal posture of her office. "Mrs. Whitman, you may speak." The elderly woman rose slowly, her pearls catching the courtroom's fluorescent lighting as she gathered herself to address the judge. "Your Honor, I understand that this man may have performed admirably in the military, but that doesn't change the fact that he was trespassing on my property. What's to stop every vagrant in the county from using similar excuses?" An uncomfortable murmur rippled through the gallery at her choice of words. Carmen Martinez tensed visibly, while Billy looked up at his mother with confusion about why the nice lady seemed angry at his hero. Judge Foster's expression hardened slightly as she addressed Mrs. Whitman directly. "Ma'am, Mr. Wells is not a vagrant. He is a decorated Marine veteran who risked his life to protect a child. The circumstances of his current housing situation do not diminish his character or his actions." "But, Your Honor," Mrs. Whitman persisted, "if we don't enforce property laws consistently, where does it end? I have a right to feel safe in my own neighborhood." Robert Taylor stepped forward, sensing an opportunity to address broader issues that his client's case had brought to light. "Your Honor, if I may, Mrs. Whitman's concerns highlight a larger problem in our community. We have numerous homeless veterans who served our country honorably, but now struggle with the transition to civilian life." Judge Foster nodded thoughtfully. "Mr. Taylor raises an important point. Mrs. Whitman, I understand your property concerns, but I would ask you to consider the context of Mr. Wells's actions. He wasn't on your property to commit theft or vandalism. He was there to save a child's life." Mrs. Whitman's attorney whispered something in her ear, but she shook her head stubbornly. "I maintain that trespassing is trespassing, regardless of the circumstances." The courtroom door opened unexpectedly, drawing everyone's attention to the entrance. A man in marine dress blue uniform strode purposefully down the aisle, his bearing immediately recognizable as active military. Captain Jake Foster had driven through the night from Camp Lejeune, arriving just as his mother was defending the man who had saved his life. "Mum," Jake said, approaching the bench with military precision before turning to face Tony Wells. The reunion between the two Marines was electric with unspoken understanding. Jake, now 29 and bearing the confident bearing of an experienced officer, extended his hand to the man who had carried him to safety 3 years earlier. "Sergeant Wells," Jake said, his voice thick with emotion, "I've been looking for you since the day I left that hospital in Germany." Tony accepted the handshake, his eyes showing the same surprise that had marked his earlier interaction with Judge Foster. "Lieutenant Foster, you look good, sir. I'm glad you recovered." "I recovered because of you," Jake replied, "and it's Captain Foster now. I got promoted partly because I lived long enough to continue serving, which happened because you refused to leave me behind." The courtroom watched this military reunion with fascination, understanding that they were witnessing something beyond the scope of typical legal proceedings. Even Mrs. Whitman seemed momentarily affected by the obvious bond between the two Marines. Jake turned to address the court directly. "Your Honor, may I speak on behalf of Sergeant Wells?" Judge Foster struggled with the ethical complexities of allowing her son to testify in a case where she was presiding. But the extraordinary circumstances seemed to call for extraordinary measures. Captain Foster, you may address the court, but I want everyone to understand that your relationship to the bench is now a matter of record. Thank you, Your Honor, Jake said, maintaining military protocol despite the personal nature of the situation. Anthony Wells is the finest Marine I've ever served with. When our convoy was hit by that IED, I was bleeding out in hostile territory. Sergeant Wells could have taken cover and waited for a safer evacuation opportunity. Instead, he exposed himself to enemy fire for 2 miles, carrying me to safety despite his own injuries. Jake's voice strengthened as he continued. But what really defines this man's character is what he did after saving my life. He visited me in the hospital every day until I was stable, making sure I had everything I needed. When I tried to thank him, he just said he was glad I would be going home to my family. Carmen Martinez wiped tears from her eyes as Jake's testimony painted a picture of the man who had saved her son, revealing depths of character that went far beyond the single act of heroism she had witnessed. The man standing before this court, Jake continued, didn't save my life because it was his job. He saved it because that's who he is, someone who puts others before himself, whether they're fellow Marines or children he's never met. Mrs. Whitman shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her black and white view of the situation becoming increasingly difficult to maintain in the face of such powerful testimony about Tony's character. Judge Foster addressed her son with careful formality. Captain Foster, do you have any knowledge of Mr. Wells's circumstances following his military discharge? Yes, ma'am. Sergeant Wells's wife died of cancer while he was deployed. He blamed himself for not being there during her illness, even though he was serving his country overseas. After his discharge, he struggled with survivor's guilt and what appeared to be depression. Despite our efforts to stay in contact, he gradually withdrew from everyone who knew him in the service. This revelation added another layer of understanding to Tony's current circumstances. The courtroom began to see not just a homeless man who had committed trespassing, but a grieving veteran whose service had cost him more than most people could imagine. Robert Taylor seized the opportunity to address the broader context of his client's situation. Your Honor, Captain Foster's testimony illustrates the complex challenges facing many of our military veterans. Mr. Wells's homelessness isn't a character defect, it's a consequence of trauma, loss, and a system that doesn't always successfully transition our heroes back into civilian life. Judge Foster looked directly at Mrs. Whitman. Ma'am, given what you've heard today about Mr. Wells's character and service, would you be willing to reconsider your position regarding prosecution? Mrs. Whitman looked around the courtroom, noting the faces of people who were clearly moved by the testimony about Tony's military service and personal sacrifices. Her lawyer leaned over to whisper something in her ear, but she waved him away. Your Honor, she said slowly, I suppose I may have been too hasty in my judgment. If this man truly saved a child's life, and if he served our country with such distinction— She paused, clearly struggling with her decision. I withdraw my complaint. The courtroom erupted in spontaneous applause, with Carmen Martinez leading the celebration by hugging Billy tightly. Robert Taylor shook Tony's hand vigorously, while Jake Foster beamed with pride at the outcome. Judge Foster called for order, though her own relief was evident. Mrs. Whitman, the court appreciates your reconsideration. Mr. Wells, all charges against you are hereby dismissed with prejudice. As the formal proceedings concluded, Jake Foster approached Tony with an urgency that spoke to 3 years of wanting to have this conversation. Tony, I need you to know that my wife and daughter exist because you saved my life. Sarah and I named our daughter Margaret after my mom, but we call her Maggie. She's 2 years old now, and she deserves to meet the man who made her father's life possible. Tony was visibly overwhelmed by the idea that his actions had rippled forward to create new life, new hope, new possibilities. "Captain, I'm honored, but I'm not exactly in a position to—" "That's exactly why I'm here," Jake interrupted. "We're going to fix that. Today." Judge Foster stepped down from the bench again, her judicial duties complete, but her personal mission just beginning. "Mr. Wells, I hope you'll allow our family to help you transition back to the kind of life you deserve. Your Honor, I appreciate the offer, but I'm not looking for charity." "It's not charity," Judge Foster replied firmly. "It's justice. The system failed you after your service, and today we begin making that right." Carmen Martinez approached with Billy, who was eager to show Tony his drawing one more time. "Mr. Tony, are you going to be okay now?" Tony knelt down to Billy's level, his weathered face softening as he looked at the child whose life had become the catalyst for this extraordinary day. "I think so, Billy. Thanks to you and your mom, people are starting to remember that heroes come in all kinds of packages." As the courtroom began to empty, leaving behind only the Foster family, Carmen and Billy and Tony Wells, the scope of what had just occurred began to sink in. A simple trespassing case had become a reunion between a mother and the man who saved her son, between two Marines whose bond transcended rank and circumstance, and between a community and a hero they had almost overlooked. The real work of rebuilding Anthony Wells's life was about to begin. But for the first time in years, he was no longer facing that challenge alone. The courthouse steps buzzed with an energy that extended far beyond the usual post-trial atmosphere. Word of the extraordinary proceedings had spread through the building's corridors, drawing court employees, attorneys, and even other judges to witness the unprecedented scene unfolding outside. Frank Morrison, a veteran reporter for the Clearwater County Herald, who had covered municipal court for 15 years, approached the group with the careful respect of someone who recognized a significant story but understood the delicate nature of the moment. "Excuse me, Judge Foster," Morrison said, introducing himself with professional courtesy. "I've been covering the courthouse for a long time, and I've never seen anything like what happened in there. Would you be willing to comment on the proceedings?" Judge Foster looked at Tony, understanding that any media attention would ultimately focus on his story rather than hers. "Mr. Morrison, I think you should direct your questions to the real hero here." Tony shifted uncomfortably under the attention, his years of invisibility on the streets making him reluctant to become the center of media focus. "I'm not much for interviews." Captain Jake Foster stepped forward, his military bearing commanding immediate respect. "Mr. Morrison, if you're going to tell this story, it needs to be told accurately. Anthony Wells is a genuine American hero who has been overlooked by the very society he risked his life to protect." Morrison nodded, pulling out a small recording device. "Captain Foster, can you provide some context about your relationship with Mr. Wells?" Jake's response was measured but passionate. 3 years ago in Afghanistan, Sergeant Wells carried me 2 miles through hostile territory after an IED explosion nearly killed me. He saved my life at considerable risk to his own. Today, we discovered he's been homeless in our community, and yesterday he saved a child from a dog attack only to be arrested for trespassing. The reporter's eyes widened as he began to grasp the full scope of the story. "So, the same man who saved your life in combat was arrested for saving another life here at home?" "That's exactly right," Judge Foster interjected. "Mr. Wells represents thousands of veterans who served our country with distinction, but struggle with the transition back to civilian life. Today's events highlight both individual heroism and systemic failures in how we care for our veterans." Carmen Martinez, who had been listening quietly while keeping Billy entertained, stepped forward with the determination that had marked her involvement from the beginning. "Mr. Morrison, I need people to understand that this man saved my son's life. He didn't hesitate, didn't think about consequences for himself. He just acted to protect a child he didn't even know. Billy looked up from his drawing, eager to contribute to the adult conversation. Mr. Tony is my hero. Can you put that in the newspaper? Morrison smiled at the boy's earnestness. I certainly can, son. Mr. Wells, would you be willing to share your perspective on what happened? Tony considered the request carefully, understanding that his words might reach other veterans who were struggling with similar challenges. I suppose if it helps other people understand that veterans need support when they come home, then it's worth talking about. The informal press conference continued on the courthouse steps, with passers-by stopping to listen as the story emerged in greater detail. Several courthouse employees had gathered, including Sergeant Parker, who had witnessed the emotional courtroom proceedings firsthand. Dr. Michael Foster, no relation to the judge despite the shared surname, approached the group with professional interest. As a psychiatrist who worked with the Veterans Affairs Medical Center, he understood the complex challenges facing former military personnel. Excuse me, Dr. Foster said, introducing himself to the group. I couldn't help but overhear your discussion. I work with veterans who are struggling with PTSD and transition issues. Mr. Wells, if you're interested, I'd like to discuss some resources that might be helpful. Tony's initial reaction was defensive, born from years of disappointing experiences with bureaucratic systems. Doc, I appreciate the offer, but I've tried the VA system before. It's not really set up to help people like me. I understand your skepticism, Dr. Foster replied. The system has significant flaws, and too many veterans fall through the cracks. But there are some newer programs specifically designed for veterans experiencing homelessness. Would you be willing to let me explain what's available? Judge Foster intervened, recognizing Tony's reluctance to accept help. Mr. Wells, would you consider joining our family for lunch? No obligations, no formal arrangements. Just a meal with people who are grateful for what you've done. Jake nodded enthusiastically. Sarah's been cooking all morning. She wanted to prepare something special when I told her I was driving up to find you. The invitation represented more than just a meal. It was an entry point back into the kind of normal human connection that Tony had avoided for years. His instinct was to decline, to return to the familiar isolation of street life, but the genuine warmth in their offer was difficult to resist. I don't want to impose on your family time, Tony said. You're not imposing, Judge Foster replied, firmly. You're accepting an invitation from people who owe you more than we can ever repay. Carmen Martinez gathered her belongings, preparing to return to her afternoon shift at the grocery store. Mr. Wells, Billy and I want to stay in touch. You're part of our family now, whether you like it or not. Billy approached Tony with his latest drawing, this one showing the courthouse with stick figures representing everyone who had been in the courtroom. This is for you to remember today. Tony accepted the drawing with visible emotion, carefully folding it to fit in his shirt pocket. Thank you, Billy. I'll treasure this. As the group began to disperse, Frank Morrison finished his notes and prepared to write what he suspected would be the most important story of his career. Mr. Wells, one last question. What would you want people to take away from what happened today? Tony considered the question carefully, his response reflecting the thoughtful nature that had marked his military service. I'd want people to understand that sometimes the folks who look like they need the most help are actually the ones most willing to help others. Don't judge people by their circumstances. Judge them by their actions. The Foster family's home sat in an established neighborhood where mature trees provided shade for well-maintained houses that spoke of middle-class stability. Sarah Foster, a warm woman in her late 20s with the practical bearing of a military spouse, had spent the morning preparing a meal that could accommodate unexpected guests. 2-year-old Maggie Foster toddled around the living room with the fearless energy of a child who had never known anything but love and security. Her grandfather Jake had told her they were having a special visitor, though at her age she couldn't understand the significance of meeting the man who had made her father's life possible. "Tony," Jake said as they entered the house, "I want you to meet my wife Sarah, and this little tornado is Maggie." Sarah approached with the gracious hospitality that came naturally to her. "Mr. Wells, I can't begin to express how grateful our family is for what you did for Jake. You gave us our life. Together." Maggie looked up at Tony with the curious assessment that toddlers bring to new people. Something in his gentle demeanor must have passed her inspection, because she offered him one of her favorite toys, a stuffed marine mascot that Jake had given her. "She doesn't usually share that with strangers," Sarah observed with amusement. "Kids have good instincts about people." The lunch conversation flowed naturally, covering topics that ranged from military experiences to civilian challenges to the small details of daily life that Tony hadn't shared with anyone in years. Judge Foster asked about his wife Margaret, and Tony found himself talking about their relationship with less pain than he'd experienced in previous years. "Margaret would have loved this," Tony said, looking around the table at the faces of people who had become unexpectedly important to him. "She always said that good people find each other when they need to most." Jake raised his glass of iced tea in an impromptu toast. "To Margaret Wells, who raised a hero." "To second chances," Judge Foster added. "To new friends," Sarah contributed. "To my daddy being safe," Maggie said solemnly, though she was too young to understand the full context of her words. After lunch, Dr. Foster called Tony's cell phone, a basic device provided by a Veterans Assistance Program, to follow up on their earlier conversation. "Mr. Wells, I've been making some calls about housing options. There's a transitional program specifically for veterans that might be a good fit for your situation." Tony listened as Dr. Foster explained a residential program that provided not just housing, but job training, counseling services, and peer support from other veterans who had successfully transitioned back to civilian life. "The program is voluntary," Dr. Foster emphasized. "You maintain your independence while having access to resources that can help you rebuild whatever kind of life you want." For the first time in years, Tony began to consider possibilities beyond simple survival. "Doc, what would I need to do to apply?" "Just show up Monday morning at 9. I'll meet you there and walk you through the process." As the afternoon drew to a close, Tony prepared to return to his familiar life on the streets, but Jake stopped him at the door. "Tony, I have a proposition for you." "What kind of proposition?" "Sarah and I have been talking, and we'd like you to stay here tonight. The guest room is available, and tomorrow we can start figuring out long-term solutions." Tony's first instinct was to decline, but Judge Foster joined the conversation with her own perspective. "Mr. Wells, sometimes accepting help is just as brave as giving it. Let us do this small thing for you." Standing in the doorway of a real home, surrounded by people who genuinely cared about his welfare, Tony made a decision that would mark the beginning of his journey back from the margins of society. "Just for tonight," he said. "Just for tonight," Jake agreed, though both men understood that this represented much more than a single evening's hospitality. As Tony settled into the guest room that night, the first real bed he'd slept in for years, he thought about the chain of events that had brought him here. Billy's innocent approach to a dangerous dog, his own instinctive reaction to protect a child, and the extraordinary coincidence that had connected him with the family whose lives he'd touched in Afghanistan. For the first time since Margaret's death, Anthony Wells allowed himself to believe that his story might not be over. Monday morning arrived with the crisp clarity that often follows life-changing events. As if the universe had shifted slightly on its axis to accommodate new possibilities. Tony woke in the Foster family guest room at 5:30, his internal military clock unchanged by years of irregular street sleeping. The comfort of clean sheets and a real mattress felt almost foreign after so long sleeping rough. Downstairs, he found Jake already awake, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a laptop computer, working on military reports before his family stirred. The domestic scene struck Tony as profoundly normal in ways he had almost forgotten were possible. "Morning, Tony," Jake said, looking up from his screen. "Coffee's fresh. Sarah bought those pastries you mentioned liking yesterday." Tony poured himself coffee, noting how Jake had remembered his casual comment about missing real Danish pastries. These small acts of consideration felt overwhelming after years of being invisible to most people. "Jake, I want to thank you and Sarah for everything, but I should probably head out before I overstay my welcome." "You're not overstaying anything," Jake replied firmly. "Besides, don't you have that appointment with Dr. Foster this morning?" The appointment. Tony had almost convinced himself during the night that the housing program was too good to be true, that bureaucratic reality would crush whatever hope had been kindled during yesterday's extraordinary events. "I'm not sure I'm ready for all that," Tony admitted. "It's been a long time since I tried to fit into normal society." Jake closed his laptop and gave Tony his full attention. "You know what I learned in the Marines? Sometimes the most important battles happen after the shooting stops. Getting your life back isn't any less brave than what you did in Afghanistan." Sarah Foster appeared in the kitchen doorway, her hair pulled back and wearing scrubs that identified her as a registered nurse at Clearwater General Hospital. "Good morning, Tony. I hope you slept well." "Better than I have in years, Mom." "Thank you." "Sarah," she corrected gently, "we're family now, remember? And I wanted you to know that I'll be working the afternoon shift today, so if you need anything after your appointment, just call." Maggie toddled into the kitchen wearing pajamas covered with cartoon characters, immediately gravitating toward Tony with the fearless affection that had marked their first meeting. She climbed onto his lap and handed him a piece of toast that she had been saving from her breakfast. "For you," she announced solemnly. The simple gesture of a child sharing her food hit Tony harder than all the official recognition and formal gratitude he had received. This was pure, uncomplicated human connection, given freely without expectation or agenda. Jake drove Tony to the Veterans Affairs Medical Center, a modern facility that represented a significant improvement over the outdated buildings Tony remembered. From his previous encounters with the VA system, Dr. Foster met them in the lobby, his professional bearing softened by genuine enthusiasm for the program he was about to describe. "Tony, I'm glad you decided to come in. I think you'll be surprised by what we've developed here." The transitional living program occupied an entire wing of the medical center, designed specifically for veterans who needed more than emergency shelter but weren't ready for completely independent living. Dr. Foster led them through common areas that resembled a college dormitory more than institutional housing. The program serves about 30 veterans at any given time, Dr. Foster explained as they walked. Some are dealing with PTSD, others with addiction issues, and some, like yourself, are simply trying to rebuild after major life disruptions. They stopped at a room that would be Tony's if he chose to enter the program. The space was small but private, with a bed, desk and window that looked out on a garden area where several residents were working with plants. "Part of the program involves vocational training," Dr. Foster continued. "We have partnerships with local employers who understand the value of hiring veterans. There's also peer counseling, group therapy if you're interested, and individual support as needed. Tony examined the room carefully, trying to imagine himself living in this structured environment after years of complete autonomy on the streets. What are the rules? Reasonable ones, Dr. Foster replied. No drugs or alcohol on the premises, participation in at least one program activity per week, and a commitment to working toward independent living within 12 months. Beyond that, you're free to come and go as you please. Jake had remained quiet during the tour, understanding that this decision had to be Tony's alone. But now he spoke up with the directness that characterized their military relationship. Tony, what's the worst that could happen? If it doesn't work out, you can always leave. But if it does work out, you could have your life back. Staff Sergeant Robert Cruz, Tony's former squad mate from Afghanistan, had been tracking down his old friend ever since news of the courthouse incident reached the veteran community through social media and local news coverage. He arrived at the VA center just as Tony was completing his intake paperwork. "Well, I'll be damned," Bobby Cruz announced as he walked into the lobby. "Tony Wells, you magnificent son of a bitch." The reunion between the two former Marines was immediate and emotional, marked by the bear hug that military brothers reserve for each other after long separations. Bobby, now working as a construction foreman and living in nearby Henderson, had been searching for Tony for over a year. "Bobby, what the hell are you doing here?" Tony asked, genuinely amazed to see another piece of his military past materialize. "Jake, Foster tracked me down yesterday after that newspaper story hit the internet. Man, the whole veteran community is talking about what happened in that courtroom, your famous brother." Dr. Foster watched the reunion with professional interest, understanding that peer support from successful veteran transitions often proved more valuable than any formal counseling program. "Mr. Cruz," Dr. Foster said, "would you be interested in participating in our peer mentor program? We're always looking for veterans who have successfully transitioned to civilian life." Bobby grinned at the suggestion. "Doc, I'd love to help other guys avoid some of the mistakes I made coming home. Tony here saved my ass more than once in Afghanistan. Time for me to return the favor." The paperwork for Tony's admission to the program took most of the morning, but the process felt different from the impersonal bureaucracy he had experienced during previous attempts to access veteran services. The staff treated him with dignity and respect, acknowledging his service while focusing on his current needs rather than his past failures. By noon, Tony had officially become a resident of the Transitional Living Program with a room key, a meal card, and a schedule of orientation activities. Bobby offered to help him collect his few belongings from the homeless camp, understanding the importance of properly concluding that chapter of Tony's life. At Desert Springs Recreation Area, the homeless community gathered to say goodbye to someone who had been a quiet but reliable presence among them for years. Pete Williams, the Vietnam veteran who served as their informal leader, presented Tony with a small American flag that had flown over their camp. "This flag represents the fact that we don't leave our people behind," Pete said. "You take care of yourself, Marine, and don't forget about the folks who are still out here." Tony accepted the flag with the solemnity appropriate to the gesture. "Pete, I'll never forget, and I'll be back to help however I can." Sarah Martinez, the older woman who had shared food and advice during his darkest days, hugged him tightly. "You go make us proud, son. Show them that homeless doesn't mean hopeless." The transition from the streets to structured housing felt surreal as Tony unpacked his few possessions in his new room. His military uniforms, carefully preserved despite years of difficult living, hung in the small closet. Margaret's photograph found a place of honor on the desk, and Billy's drawings were taped to the wall above his bed. That evening he joined other program residents for dinner in the common dining area. The conversation was tentative at first, as veterans with diverse backgrounds and experiences began to share their stories. Some were recent combat veterans struggling with PTSD, others were older veterans dealing with addiction or family problems, and a few, like Tony, were simply trying to rebuild lives that had been derailed by circumstances beyond their control. Marcus Jones, the young Army veteran Tony had met in jail, was surprised to discover his former cellmate at the dinner table. "Tony, man, I heard about what happened in court. That's incredible." "Marcus, what brings you here? Got arrested again for sleeping in the wrong place. My public defender heard about this program and thought it might help. Beats jail, that's for sure." Dr. Foster stopped by the dining area to check on the newest residents, pleased to see Tony engaging naturally with his peers. "How are you settling in, Tony?" "Still feels a little strange, Doc, but good strange. Like maybe there's a chance to build something real again." That's exactly the attitude that leads to success in this program. Tomorrow, we'll start talking about vocational training options and long-term goals. Later that evening, Tony called Judge Foster to update her on his first day in the program. Her genuine interest in his progress reinforced his sense that the connections made during the courthouse incident were more than temporary sympathy. "Tony, Sarah and I want you to know that our guest room is always available whenever you need a break from institutional living. Maggie has been asking when her new uncle is coming back to visit." "Judge Foster, I can't tell you how much your family's support means to me. For the first time in years, I feel like I have a future worth working toward." As Tony prepared for bed in his new room, he reflected on the chain of events that had brought him here. Billy's innocent approach to a dangerous dog had triggered a series of coincidences and revelations that had fundamentally altered the trajectory of his life. He thought about Margaret and what she would have said about these developments. She had always believed that good things happened to people who kept faith in humanity, even when humanity seemed to have lost faith in them. For the first time since her death, Tony fell asleep, not just hoping to survive until morning, but actually looking forward to what tomorrow might bring. 3 weeks into the transitional living program, Tony had established a routine that balanced structure with the gradual rebuilding of his sense of purpose. Morning physical training with other veteran residents had restored some of the physical conditioning he'd lost during his years on the streets, while afternoon vocational classes were reawakening skills that had been dormant since his military discharge. The carpentry workshop had become his favorite part of the program. Working with his hands to create something useful provided a satisfaction that had been missing from his life since Margaret's death. The instructor, a retired Navy chief named Tom Rodriguez, understood that many veterans found healing through productive work. "Wells, your joints are tight, but your eye for precision is still there," Chief Rodriguez observed as Tony completed a cabinet door that would be donated to a local family shelter. "Ever think about making this a career?" Tony paused in his sanding to consider the question. "I used to build things with my dad when I was a kid. Always figured I'd go back to it after the Marines, but life got complicated." "Life gets complicated for all of us," Rodriguez replied. "The question is what we do when it starts getting simple again." The media attention from Tony's courthouse incident had continued to grow, with his story being picked up by national veterans organizations and news outlets. Frank Morrison's original article had been syndicated across Nevada and neighboring states, generating responses from veterans, their families, and civilians who wanted to help address the broader issues highlighted by Tony's case. Dr. Foster knocked on the workshop door, interrupting Tony's concentration on the cabinet project. "Tony, I need to speak with you about something important. There's someone here who'd like to meet you." In Dr. Foster's office waited Colonel David Mitchell, Tony's former commanding officer who had driven up from Camp Pendleton specifically to see his former sergeant. The colonel's presence filled the small office with the same command authority that Tony remembered from their deployment days. "Sergeant Wells," Colonel Mitchell said, rising to shake hands with military precision. "I've been following your story. Since Judge Foster's son contacted me, I'm here to discuss some opportunities that have developed." Tony accepted the handshake, noting that his former colonel looked older but maintained the fitness and bearing that marked career military officers. "Colonel Mitchell, sir, I appreciate you making the trip, but if this is about re-enlisting, I think my service days are behind me." "Not re-enlisting," Colonel Mitchell clarified, settling back into his chair. "But your story has caught the attention of some important people in Washington. The Marine Corps is developing a new program to help veterans transition successfully to civilian life, and they want someone with your experience and credibility to help design it." Dr. Foster watched Tony's reaction carefully, understanding that this offer represented validation from the institution that had shaped so much of his identity. "Tony, Colonel Mitchell isn't talking about charity work. This would be a paid consultant position that could lead to permanent employment with the Veterans Administration. The offer was overwhelming in its implications. For years, Tony had felt disconnected from his military identity, carrying his service record like a burden rather than a source of pride. Now the Corps was asking him to help other veterans avoid the pitfalls that had derailed his own transition. "Colonel, I appreciate the confidence, but I'm not sure I'm qualified to advise anyone. Look where my own transition led me." Colonel Mitchell's expression grew serious. "Sergeant, that's exactly why you're qualified. You've experienced the worst-case scenario and found your way back. Other veterans need to hear from someone who understands their struggles firsthand." Before Tony could respond, his phone buzzed. With a text from Carmen Martinez. Billy's school was having a career day, and she wanted to know if Tony would be willing to speak to the children about military service. The timing of her request, coming simultaneously with Colonel Mitchell's offer, felt like another one of those meaningful coincidences that had marked his recent experiences. "Ma'am, could you give me a few days to think about this?" Tony asked Dr. Foster. "Of course, but Tony, I want you to understand that opportunities like this don't come along often. Your story has resonated with people because it's authentic. Don't underestimate the value of that authenticity." That evening, Tony walked through the gardens behind the VA Center, a space where many residents went to think through difficult decisions. Bobby Cruz found him there, sitting on a bench overlooking the desert landscape that stretched toward the mountains. "Heard you had a visit from the brass today," Bobby said, settling beside his friend. "Big decisions ahead?" Tony explained Colonel Mitchell's offer and Carmen's request, trying to articulate his uncertainty about stepping back into a more public role. "Bobby, I've been invisible for so long. I'm not sure I know how to be visible again." "You know what I think?" Bobby replied. "I think you've been visible all along. You just haven't been seen by the right people. That kid Billy saw you, Judge Foster saw you, your old squad mates always saw you. Maybe it's time to let more people benefit from who you really are." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Marcus Jones, the young Army veteran who had become Tony's closest friend among the program residents. Marcus carried a laptop computer and wore the excited expression of someone with good news to share. "Tony, you need to see this," Marcus said, opening the laptop to display a news website. "Check out what's happening." The screen showed a crowd gathering outside the Clearwater County Courthouse, holding signs that read, "Veterans deserve better," and "Heroes helping heroes." The demonstration had been organized by a coalition of veteran groups inspired by Tony's story, demanding increased funding for veteran transition programs and better support for homeless former service members. "There's more," Marcus continued, clicking through several news articles. "Veterans organizations in 12 states are using your story to push for policy changes. You've become a symbol, man." The weight of this revelation settled heavily on Tony's shoulders. He had saved one child from a dog attack, and somehow that action had become a catalyst for a much larger conversation about how America treats its veterans. Dr. Foster appeared on the garden path, having searched for Tony when he missed his evening group therapy session. "Tony, I wanted to update you on something. We've received over 50 applications from veterans who want to enter our program, all of them citing your story as inspiration to seek help." "Dr. Foster, I never intended for any of this attention. The best symbols rarely do," Dr. Foster replied. "But now that you have this platform, you have a choice about how to use it." The next morning brought another unexpected visitor. Judge Margaret Foster arrived at the VA Center, accompanied by a distinguished woman in her 60s who introduced herself as Senator Patricia Reynolds, chair of the Senate Veterans Affairs Committee. "Mr. Wells," Senator Reynolds said, "I've traveled from Washington specifically to meet you. Your experience highlights critical gaps in our veteran support systems, and I'd like your input on proposed legislation." The meeting took place in the center's conference room, with Dr. Foster, Colonel Mitchell participating by phone, and several VA administrators present. Senator Reynolds outlined proposed changes to veteran transition programs, housing assistance, and mental health services. "Mr. Wells, based on your experience, what would have made the biggest difference in preventing your homelessness?" Tony considered the question carefully, drawing on years of reflection about his own struggles and observations of other veterans facing similar challenges. "Senator, the biggest problem isn't lack of programs. It's that the programs aren't connected to each other. When my wife died, I needed grief counseling, financial planning, job placement, and housing assistance all at the same time. But each agency operated separately, and I fell through the cracks." His analysis sparked a lengthy discussion about coordinated care and integrated services. Senator Reynolds took detailed notes, clearly impressed by Tony's thoughtful approach to complexity. "Policy issues. Would you be willing to testify before the Veterans Affairs Committee?" she asked. "Your perspective could be instrumental in securing support for comprehensive reform." The request represented another step toward a more public role that both excited and intimidated Tony. Judge Foster, who had observed the conversation with growing pride, offered her perspective. "Senator Reynolds, Mr. Wells has already demonstrated remarkable courage in combat and in civilian life. I have complete confidence in his ability to serve his fellow veterans in whatever capacity he chooses." After the senator departed, Tony found himself alone with Judge Foster in the conference room. The woman who had presided over his arraignment just weeks earlier had become something like a mentor, offering guidance without pressure as he navigated these new opportunities. "Judge Foster, everything is happening so fast. A month ago I was collecting bottles for recycling money. Now people want me to testify before Congress." "Tony, do you remember what you told that reporter on the courthouse steps? You said people should be judged by their actions, not their circumstances. Your actions have consistently demonstrated character, courage, and compassion. The circumstances that made you homeless don't diminish those qualities." That evening, Tony called Carmen Martinez to accept her invitation to speak at Billy's school. Her delight was infectious, and she immediately began planning how to make his visit meaningful for the children. "Billy has been telling everyone that his hero is coming to school," Carmen said. "You've given my son confidence that good people exist in the world." As Tony prepared for bed that night, he reflected on the rapid changes in his life. The scared, isolated man who had been sleeping in doorways just weeks earlier was being asked to help shape national policy on veteran affairs. The transformation felt surreal, but it also felt purposeful in ways he hadn't experienced since Margaret's death. His phone rang just before he fell asleep. Jake Foster was calling from North Carolina, where he was completing advanced training for his next deployment. "Tony, I wanted you to know that Sarah and I have been following all the news coverage. We're proud of how you're handling everything. Jake, sometimes I feel like I'm in over my head. That's normal, but remember, you've never backed down from a challenge when lives were at stake. This is just a different kind of mission." As Tony finally drifted off to sleep, he thought about missions and purposes, about the unexpected ways that life can change direction when you least expect it. Tomorrow would bring new decisions about his role in veteran advocacy, but tonight he was simply grateful to be sleeping in a real bed, surrounded by people who believed in his potential to make a difference. 6 months after the courthouse incident that changed everything, Tony Wells stood before the Senate Veterans Affairs Committee in Washington, D.C., wearing a suit that Jake Foster had helped him select for this momentous occasion. The committee room buzzed with the energy of lawmakers, advocates, and media representatives gathered to hear testimony on the Comprehensive Veterans Transition Act. Senator Patricia Reynolds called the hearing to order with the authority that comes from years of legislative experience. Today, we hear from individuals whose experiences highlight both the failures and potential of our veteran support systems. Our first witness is Anthony Wells, United States Marine Corps veteran and consultant to the Veterans Transition Task Force. Tony approached the witness table with the same steady bearing that had carried him through combat deployments and years of homelessness. In the gallery behind him sat Judge Margaret Foster, Jake, and Sarah Foster, with little Maggie, Carmen, and Billy Martinez and Bobby Cruz, all having traveled to Washington to support him during this crucial testimony. "Mr. Wells," Senator Reynolds began, "please tell the committee about your transition from military service to civilian life." Tony's voice carried clearly through the room's acoustics as he began his prepared statement. "Senators, I served 3 tours in Afghanistan with the 2nd Battalion, 8th Marines. When I returned home, I thought the hard part was over. I was wrong." He detailed his wife's illness and death, his struggles with grief and survivor's guilt, and the gradual slide into homelessness that had consumed 5 years of his life. The committee listened with respectful attention as he described sleeping in doorways, collecting bottles for survival, and becoming invisible to the society he had served. "The current system treats veteran issues in isolation," Tony continued. "Mental health, housing, employment, and family services operate as separate programs with different eligibility requirements and conflicting timelines. Veterans fall through the gaps between these programs." Senator James Harrison, the committee's ranking member, leaned forward with interest. "Mr. Wells, you've proposed a coordinated care model. Can you explain how that would work practically?" Tony had spent weeks preparing for this question, working with Dr. Foster and Colonel Mitchell to develop concrete policy recommendations. "Senator, imagine a single intake process where a veteran's needs are assessed comprehensively. Instead of applying to multiple agencies separately, they would be assigned a case coordinator who ensures all services work together toward the same goals." He cited examples from his own experience and that of other veterans he'd met through the Transitional Living Program. "When I was homeless, I qualified for housing assistance, but the waiting list was 18 months. I also qualified for job training, but couldn't participate without stable housing. Meanwhile, my mental health counseling was scheduled during hours when I needed to search for day labor to survive. None of these programs communicated with each other." The questioning continued for 2 hours, with Tony fielding inquiries about funding mechanisms, program oversight, and measurable outcomes. His responses reflected not just personal experience, but the research and policy analysis he'd conducted during his months as a consultant. Senator Maria Gonzalez, herself a Navy veteran, asked the final question. Mr. Wells, what would you say to Americans who believe that veterans should be able to handle these transitions without government assistance? Tony paused, considering his response carefully. Senator, I would tell them that military service changes people in ways that can't be undone. We're trained to suppress emotions, to prioritize mission over personal needs, and to solve problems through action rather than discussion. These qualities serve the military well, but they can become barriers to successful civilian integration. His voice strengthened as he continued. Every veteran deserves the chance to rebuild their life with dignity. Some need minimal assistance, others require comprehensive support. The question isn't whether we should help veterans transition. It's whether we should do it efficiently or continue wasting resources on a fragmented system that fails too many people. The hearing concluded with Senator Reynolds announcing that the committee would vote on the proposed legislation within 2 weeks, incorporating Tony's recommendations into the final bill. Outside the Capitol building, Tony was surrounded by reporters seeking additional comments. Frank Morrison, the Clearwater County Herald journalist whose original article had started the media attention, conducted a brief interview about Tony's remarkable journey from homeless veteran to policy advocate. Mr. Wells, when you saved Billy Martinez from that dog attack 8 months ago, could you have imagined it would lead to testifying before Congress? Tony smiled, thinking about the chain of unlikely events that had brought him to this moment. Frank, I've learned that life has a way of connecting moments in ways we can't predict. I saved Billy because it was the right thing to do. Everything that followed happened because people chose to see possibility instead of just problems. Judge Foster approached as the interview concluded, her pride in Tony's accomplishments evident in her expression. Tony, Margaret would be so proud of what you've accomplished. Judge Foster, none of this would have been possible without your family's support. You saw potential in me when I couldn't see it in myself. Billy Martinez, now 9 years old and taller than when Tony had first saved him, presented Tony with another drawing. This one showed Tony speaking to a room full of important-looking people with the caption, "My hero helps other heroes." Mr. Tony, my mom says you're helping other soldiers now. That's right, Billy. I'm trying to make sure other veterans get the help they need so they don't have to go through what I went through. Carmen Martinez, who had followed Tony's journey with the dedication of someone invested in his success, hugged him warmly. Tony, you've shown my son that one person really can make a difference in the world. The celebration continued that evening at a restaurant near the Capitol, where Tony's support network gathered to mark this milestone in his recovery. Jake Foster, now a major and preparing for another deployment, raised a toast to his friend and former sergeant. To Tony Wells, who proves that heroes don't wear capes. They wear whatever they have, show up when needed, and never stop serving others. Bobby Cruz, who had been accepted into the peer counselor program and was helping other veterans navigate their transitions, offered his own perspective. Tony, you've shown all of us that rock bottom can be a foundation for building something better. 2 weeks later, the Comprehensive Veterans Transition Act passed the Senate by a margin of 78-22, with the House following suit 3 days later. President Maria Santos signed the legislation into law during a Rose Garden ceremony, attended by veteran advocates from across the country, including Tony Wells. As the president handed Tony the pen used to sign the bill, she spoke quietly enough that only he could hear. Mr. Wells, your courage in sharing your story has changed how America cares for its veterans. Thank you for your service, both in uniform and as a civilian. Tony returned to Nevada as the newly appointed director of Veteran Transition Services for the Western region, overseeing implementation of the coordinated care model he had helped design. His office was located at the VA Medical Center, where his own recovery had begun, creating a symbolic connection between his personal journey and his professional mission. The Transitional Living Program had expanded to serve 150 veterans, with similar programs opening in 6 other states based on the Nevada model. Tony's morning routine now included reviewing case files, meeting with program participants, and coordinating with other agencies to ensure seamless service delivery. Dr. Foster, promoted to regional director following the program's success, worked closely with Tony to maintain the personal touch that had made their approach effective. "Tony, we're getting requests from veterans organizations nationwide wanting to replicate what we've built here." Dr. Foster, "I never imagined that saving one kid from a dog attack would lead to all this." "That's the thing about authentic heroes," Dr. Foster replied. "They don't set out to change the world. They just do the right thing and the world changes around them." On weekends, Tony often returned to Desert Springs Recreation Area, bringing supplies and information about available services to the homeless veterans who remained there. Pete Williams, now in his 70s, but still serving as the camp's informal leader, had become one of Tony's most effective recruiters for the transition program. "Tony brings hope," Pete told newcomers to the camp. "He shows us that homeless doesn't mean hopeless." The small apartment Tony now rented near the VA center contained photographs that told the story of his remarkable journey. Margaret's picture still held the place of honor on his desk, but it was now surrounded by images of the extended family he had gained. The Fosters, the Martinez family, his fellow veterans, and the hundreds of people whose lives had been touched by his advocacy. Billy Martinez, now 10 and excelling in school, still drew pictures for Tony, though they had evolved from simple scenes to complex illustrations of his dreams for the future. His latest drawing showed himself in a military uniform with a caption reading, "When I grow up, I want to help people like Mr. Tony does." Carmen had completed her nursing degree with financial assistance from a scholarship fund established in Tony's honor, and now worked at the VA Medical Center alongside Sarah Foster. "Tony," she told him during a chance encounter in the hospital corridor, "you didn't just save Billy's life that day, you saved our whole family's future." On the first anniversary of the courthouse incident, Judge Margaret Foster organized a celebration that brought together everyone whose lives had been changed by Tony's actions. The event was held at the Clearwater County Courthouse, in the same building where Tony had once stood as a defendant charged with trespassing. Frank Morrison, now covering veteran affairs for a national news magazine, interviewed Tony about the significance of returning to the courthouse under such different circumstances. "Tony, what goes through your mind standing here a year later?" Tony looked around the courthouse lobby, remembering the scared, isolated man he had been when he first entered this building in handcuffs. "Frank, I think about second chances and the people who choose to offer them. A year ago, I was nobody special. Today, I'm exactly the same person, but now people see the potential that was always there." Judge Foster, who had recused herself from criminal cases to focus on veteran affairs advocacy, approached with Maggie Foster, now 3 years old, and calling Tony Uncle Tony with the unself-conscious affection of childhood. "Uncle Tony," Maggie announced solemnly, "Daddy says you're a superhero." Tony knelt down to her level, smiling at the child whose father's life he had saved in Afghanistan. "Maggie, superheroes are just regular people who help others when they can. You can be a superhero, too." As the celebration continued around him, Tony reflected on the unpredictable nature of life's journey. A split-second decision to protect a child had led to recognition, recovery, and a renewed sense of purpose that had transformed not just his own life, but the lives of countless other veterans. Margaret's voice seemed to whisper in his memory, Good people find each other when they need to most. Standing in the courthouse where his remarkable second chapter had begun, surrounded by the family he had gained and the community he now served, Anthony Wells understood that heroism wasn't about grand gestures or perfect people. It was about ordinary individuals who chose to act with courage and compassion when the moment demanded it. The homeless Marine, who had once been invisible on the streets of Clearwater County, had become a voice for thousands of forgotten veterans, proving that sometimes the greatest victories come not from defeating enemies, but from refusing to abandon hope, even when hope seems impossible to find. The end. Up next, 2 more incredible stories are waiting for you right on your screen. If you enjoyed this one, you won't want to miss this. Just click to watch. And don't forget to subscribe. It would mean a lot.